Television is such a normal part of life that we rarely stop to think about it, but it completely transformed one part of our day, the evening. For thousands of years, people finished dinner, cleared the table, and somehow filled the next 3 to 4 hours without ever reaching for a remote control. So what did those evenings actually look like? How did they spend those hours between dinner and bed? A little while ago, Will and I were talking about our evening routine. Most nights are pretty predictable. We eat dinner while watching an episode of Supernatural, maybe have dessert, do the dishes, watch a little more TV, and before you know it, it's time to take Mildred out and get ready for bed. And it's not like we don't enjoy those evenings, but we were just starting to feel like we were spending our evenings on autopilot. So we looked at each other and realized we'd somehow turned, what should we do tonight into a question we had stopped asking years ago. So we were trying to think of ways to mix things up a little bit. And we ended up asking, what did people actually do in the evening before television? It's easy to say, well, people read books or they played cards, but that's not really an evening, is it? An evening can be many things, but it's typically centered around a routine or habits. It's the way one part of your day turns into the next. The more examples I came across, the more I realized there wasn't one evening routine before television. There were dozens. A farmer in rural Iowa, a shopkeeper in London, a factory worker in Chicago, and a wealthy family with servants weren't ending their day in anything close to the same way. The time they finished work was different. How much free time they had was different. And even what home looked like was different. So instead of looking for one kind of universal evening routine, I started looking at the patterns that kept showing up across all of them. Because regardless of whether someone was wealthy or working class, whether they lived in a city apartment or a farm, everyone eventually reached that same moment. Dinner was over, the work of the day was mostly finished, and the question became, what happened next? For most people, the evening had a purpose. Sometimes that purpose was practical, sometimes it was social, and sometimes it was just simply giving your body and mind a chance to slow down after the day. And more often than not, it was a combination of all three. That might sound obvious, but I don't think it's really something that we think about much today. Most of us don't consciously decide what our evenings are for. We just have evenings. After dinner wasn't necessarily the point where everyone finally got to relax for the day. In a lot of households, there was still plenty to do. The table had to be cleared, dishes washed, clothes mended, shoes cleaned, or lunches prepared for the next day. And on farms, there was often animals that still needed to be taken care of before anyone could think about sitting down and relaxing. And most of these jobs weren't usually done in isolation. People talked while they worked. Someone might be sewing or mending while another person read the newspaper or read a book aloud. Children might be finishing homework at the kitchen table while everyone else carried on with whatever needed doing. It wasn't really a case of work first and then relaxation later. These two things often happened at the same time. Today we'd probably call that multitasking, but I don't really think that's what it was. It was just evening life. There wasn't always a sharp line between work and leisure. There was a sort of prevening.
Prevening. Fairly certain it will catch on as it feels a desperate need.
Once the household was ready for tomorrow, the evening then had a chance to slow down a little bit. And what happened next depended very much on who you were. Now, if you asked me what I was doing tonight, my answer would probably be the same thing. Watching TV with Will. Maybe we'll watch a movie, maybe a couple of episodes of our shows. but it's essentially one activity that lasts the rest of the evening. But 100 years ago, leisure evenings seemed to have a little more variety to them. You might spend half an hour writing a letter to a friend or family member, then pick up a magazine for a little while. Someone in the house might sit down at the piano or suggest a game of cards. If the weather was nice, people often went for an evening walk. Sometimes neighbors dropped by for a visit, and sometimes you were the one doing the visiting. None of these activities were unusual. They were all perfectly ordinary ways to spend an evening. And they didn't necessarily happen every single night. We often talk about the evening routine as though everyone had one fixed schedule they followed day after day. But people's evenings seem to have been much more flexible than that. The routine wasn't necessarily what you did. The routine was that this was the part of the day when work was winding down, people came together, and there was finally a little room to choose how you spent the next couple of hours. If you look at these different evening activities, you might notice that they have something in common. They weren't just ways to fill the hours until bedtime. Almost every one of them engaged you in a slightly different way. Reading asked you to imagine. Writing a letter asked you to reflect on your day or think about another person. Playing cards or dominoes brought people together around the same table. Knitting, embroidery, mending clothes, or even polishing shoes kept your hands busy without demanding all of your attention. Today, we actually know quite a bit about what activities like this do for our brains. Take knitting, for example. Researchers have found that repetitive handwork can help lower stress and encourage a calm, focused state. It's one of the reasons so many people today describe knitting, crocheting, or embroidery as almost meditative. They aren't just making something, they're giving their minds a chance to settle. Reading does something different. Unlike watching television, your brain has to build the world itself. You imagine the characters, the setting, the voices, even the pace of the story. It's a much more active process than we sometimes realize. Even something as simple as an evening walk turns out to have benefits we understand much better today. A gentle walk after dinner can help with digestion, improve blood sugar regulation, lower stress, and even spark creative thinking. People in the 1930s weren't taking evening strolls because a scientific paper told them to. They were doing it because it was pleasant, it got them out of the house, and it gave them a chance to talk or think. And most importantly, there were simply more quiet moments where nothing particularly exciting was happening. You might sit by the fire while someone else finished mending a shirt. You might stare out of the window for a few minutes before you pick up your book again, or just sit with your own thoughts. Novel idea, right? We've become so good at filling every spare moment that boredom feels like something to avoid at all costs. And while nobody is suggesting that we all sit around being bored for hours, those quieter, unstimulated moments seem to serve an important purpose. They're often when our brains process memories, make unexpected connections between ideas, daydream, and recover from constant input. Of course, I'm not saying that people in the 1920s had somehow discovered the secret to mental well-being. Far from it. But I do think they experienced more moments when their minds were allowed to wander simply because there wasn't always something competing for their attention. For most of history, entertainment wasn't really something you consumed. It was something you participated in. You sang, played an instrument, read or wrote. You played games, you told stories. Even when the radio arrived in people's homes, it didn't immediately replace those things. If anything, it often became part of them. Families listened to news broadcasts or dramas or variety shows while someone knitted or another person worked on a crossword puzzle. The radio gave people something to listen to, but it didn't necessarily demand all of their attention. Television changed that. For the first time, entertainment wasn't just asking for your ears. It wanted your eyes too. And that is a surprisingly big shift. It's hard to knit while watching a television drama for the first time. It's harder to carry on a conversation when everyone's looking in the same direction. The room itself almost changed shape. Instead of people naturally facing one another, furniture gradually started facing the television. That doesn't mean evenings suddenly became worse. There's a reason television became so incredibly popular. It gathered so many of the things that people were already looking for at the end of the day: stories, comedy, music, the news, a chance to laugh and unwind. It wrapped all of those things into one simple decision. What are we watching tonight? When you think about it that way, it's not really surprising that television became the centerpiece of so many evenings. It wasn't replacing one pastime. It was replacing dozens of little choices with one very easy one. And in a lot of ways, our phones have taken that one step further. Now, instead of gathering around one shared screen, each of us carries an endless stream of entertainment on demand and in quick succession. If there's a quiet moment while we're waiting for the kettle to boil, or standing in line, or sitting on the couch, we rarely have to decide what to do with it. Something is already waiting for us. So what do we do with this? I've been thinking a lot about that conversation that I had with Will since I started writing this video, and I don't think the answer was ever to stop watching television. Honestly, I like television. I like sitting down with Will and watching our shows. There's nothing wrong with that. And I don't think people in the 1930s were somehow having better evenings than we were. But I do think I came away from this with a different appreciation for how flexible an evening can be. I think I started treating the hours after dinner as one block of time. Dinner, television, bed. Looking back 100 years, evenings seem to have more texture. Maybe you read for 20 minutes, maybe you wrote a letter, took a short walk while there was still some daylight, or visited with neighbors. Of course, not everyone had these idyllic evenings. A factory worker who'd spent 10 hours on their feet wasn't necessarily eager to gather around the piano afterward. Wealth, class, gender, age, and where you lived all shaped what your evenings looked like. But across those differences, one thing just kept showing up. Evenings tended to include a wider variety of activities than many of ours do today. And I think that's the part that I'd like to borrow from history. The idea that an evening doesn't have to be one thing. I started making this video because I wanted to know how people spent their evenings before television. But I finished it with a completely different question. How do I want to spend mine? Maybe tomorrow we'll still watch Supernatural, or maybe we'll listen to a podcast. Maybe I'll pick up the cross-stitch project I've been meaning to finish. Maybe we'll just sit in the backyard with a cup of tea for half an hour and do absolutely nothing. I don't know. And that's what I love about history. Sometimes it doesn't give us answers. It just reminds us that there are more possibilities than we'd forgotten. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.